Good morning. I am Claudia Errico, and I'm a senior scientist at Philips Research North America. Today, I will be discussing the dissemination of transcranial ultrasound imaging technologies. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the U.S. Army Medical Research Acquisition activity, as our work was supported by the Physiological Health and Traumatic Brain Injury through the Combat Casualty Care Research Program. In Philips Research North America, we are a large group of scientists and engineers. And today here, I am representing the non-invasive transcranial pressure team. To start with, the dissemination pathway of ultrasound imaging technologies within Philips always starts with 4 building blocks: clinical application, the problem that we're trying to solve, the solution that needs to be a viable, of course, solution that meets our company and business goals, and then the path for commercialization that usually follows many steps. To start with today, I will discuss, of course, brain imaging application. And like any other clinical applications, we're always looking at the problems that we're trying to solve. And in order to do so, whenever we have a problem statement, we go ahead and we identify our customers and their pain points. The reason why we need to do so is because we have to come up with the key technology. We have to identify a key technology, build a value proposition, and then eventually a prototype that we consider to be usually a minimum viable product. Like I mentioned earlier, throughout this entire process and framework, we always need to ensure that we align with our business and company goals that are represented by reduce the cost of care, increase the patient experience and staff satisfaction, and improved health outcomes. When it comes to commercialization, there are different steps that needs to be followed that start from finding collaborators for feasibility multi-center studies, working with regulatory and the quality team for IRB protocol, the design of the clinical studies, FDA claims and approvals, working with sales and marketing for competitive advantage analysis and intelligence, and then eventually working with the legal team in order to protect our inventions. The dissemination pathway for transcranial ultrasound imaging, which is what we're focusing on today, will gravitate specifically around traumatic brain injury, so TBI, and the problems that we're trying to solve are mostly focused on the uncertainty in secondary brain injury and the absence of non-invasive measurements to establish the brain health. The reason why we decide to mostly focus on brain injury due to hypoxia is because you understand that the brain consumes, of course, oxygen. Oxygen is delivered through the capillaries drain to the veins, and many other critical complex processing occur to keep the brain functioning and healthy. The images that you see here playing are actually transcranial slices that are acquired on a rat brain. And the reason why these are acquired transcranially with ultrasound imaging with a technique called super resolution imaging that relies on contrast agents. And the reason why we are using these images today just to display is because we want to highlight how dense is the vascular tree in the brain, how important it is to keep it properly perfused. When TBI happens, usually the intracranial pressure goes up, the blood flow is reduced, and the partial pressure of oxygen in brain tissue is reduced, which is what actually causes a secondary severe brain damage. So the problem that we are trying to solve today are basically two. The first is how do we come up with quantitative measurements for TBI severity that are not invasive? And the second one is how do we actually assess secondary brain injury that is caused by TBI? So here we're trying as Philips and collaborators to develop a solution that is a non-invasive intracranial pressure measurement for the assessment of secondary brain injury from TBI. Like I mentioned earlier, whenever we have a problem statement, we always have to validate it and go out there and identify customers and people that deal with these measurements on a daily basis and understand their pain points. So in 2019, between July and September, we identified trauma surgeons, ED doctors, nurses, neurologists, and intensivists that we interviewed with a 30-minute came in and interviewed that were open-ended, no solution, no prototype, no idea what was whatsoever discussed with them in order to avoid biases in our conversation. And we found out that there are four main pain points. The first is the inability to definitively diagnose the head injury. So the fact that TBI patients are usually sent to hospital with the wrong level of care, because of course it's quite challenging at this point, right? Non-invasively to establish the severity of TBI. Secondly, when surgery is not required, it's hard to convince neurosurgeons, which are skeptical with placing an ICP monitor in patients, which could eventually put them at risk for secondary injury from invasive ICP monitoring. The third pain point is actually understanding if the patient that is coming in with an altered mental status is actually having a head injury. Sometimes patients come in with an altered mental status that is due to different conditions that actually a TBI. And then eventually, the need for a CT scan to detect bleeding in the brain, because sometimes we wonder, especially with children, if it's necessary to expose them to additional radiation, or even patients may be located in an area where a CT scan is not available, or at the moment when they arrive, the CT scan may not be available. So our customers summed their pain points and their requests in basically having one single device that is able to perform a measurement non-invasively and establish what is the severity level of a head injury that they have to that they're dealing with. So us as Philips, we are responsible for developing a solution, and in this case, we're developing a solution that is accessing the intracranial pressure non-invasively for measurement of quantitative assessment of secondary brain injury via ultrasound. So this sort of prototype that you see here, which for confidential reason, I cannot display the actual prototype, is quite similar to what we envision. It's an ultrasound probe connected to a portable ultrasound system like Lumify, that however will be modified to a more wearable form factor, that it's responsible for outputting and performing this non-invasive intracranial pressure measurements. The request that came from our customers is that this device must be simple to use, needs to have a quality indicator, and also needs to be easily placed on the head of the patient, but also easy to remove in case, for instance, a CT scan is actually required. Needs to perform a measurement quite quickly, within 1 minute or two, and needs to be inexpensive. So basically, we need to make sure that we align with customers and also with customer requests, but also with company goals, where lowering the costs leads to better outcomes and also avoiding repeated exams or unnecessary exams. Avoiding unnecessary exams and proposing non-invasive solutions, of course, increases the experience on the patient side. Providing one single device with quality indicator and measurements is definitely something that users and our customers are requiring. And then eventually the whole framework fits under the idea of better outcomes for faster and higher precision care. So now that we know what type of solution we need to develop, we need to understand who's the team, who needs to be on the team. So we start from clinical scientists and scientists that build algorithms, software developers that ensure that whatever is the algorithm built by clinical scientists can be easily transferred over certain platforms, mechanical engineers, designers, and electrical engineers that ensure that the hardware part is properly functioning, regulatory and quality that establish the safety of the devices, legal, an intellectual property department take care of protecting our innovation. Medical and clinical affairs work with the team and with clinicians to design clinical studies. And then eventually, like I mentioned earlier, sales and marketing are performing market intelligence and establish what is the competitive advantage of the design of our device. So going into the technology, Philips leveraged a collaboration with MIT, and this group of scientists at MIT actually developed the real-time and automated monitoring algorithm for non-invasive intracranial pressure, where the ICP is estimated not invasively with the use of transcranial ultrasound by taking basically two waveforms. The first is the cellular blood flow velocity from the MCA, and the second waveform comes from an invasive arterial blood pressure measurement. The graph that you actually see here, A and B, are the representation of their estimation of the non-invasive ICP, where in case A, we have a normal patient. In case B, we have an episode of elevated ICP. And when they fit these waveforms into their mathematical model, you see that the blue and the red curve representing non-invasive and invasive ICP measurements are actually pretty close. So this technology seems to be a viable solution for non-invasive intracranial pressure measurements. However, Philips decided to continue with a fully non-invasive integrated solution. So while using the nICP algorithm from MIT, we also took into consideration of having fully non-invasive solution and relying on the caretaker medical device that is actually measuring the blood pressure non-invasively. On our hand, of course, there's a lot of effort in developing the ultrasound device and this helmet that you actually see pictured here as a very first prototype on the left. So what are the advantages, of course, of coming with this integrated solution is that it's, of course, is non-invasive, but it can also be used in different settings. It can be used in ICU, emergency department, during the transportation of patients, but also at the point of injury, where sometimes, it's very important to address the severity of TBI promptly. Eventually, we need to always consider as a healthcare company that we are addressing not only experienced users, but also novice users, especially when we think about such a traumatic injury that could happen anywhere. We could find any user actually handling and manipulating our device. So we decided to develop an AI-assisted clinical workflow for accurate cellular blood flow velocity measurements by providing assistance in finding the MCA and also providing the quality of the waveform that are recorded. So in terms of AI, we trained a deep learning network under the name of YOLO V3 Tiny, which is basically a regression approach that finds objects and landmark in images. Here, we're detecting the MCA in ultrasound transcranial images. The white box is the ground truth. The green box is the prediction from YOLO. The green dot represents the pulse wave gate. So basically what we're doing, we are acquiring this velocity waveform, and then we are establishing whether this measurement, this data is of a high or low quality, because we always want to ensure that whatever measurement we are performing is not done on poor quality data. So to conclude, bringing an idea into market requires multiple steps, starting from evaluating its clinical value, business value, and then all the steps that needs to be followed for commercialization. We started with a minimum viable product and protecting the invention with patents, assessing the risks and the safety of this device, and then finding clinical collaborators that are willing to test our device. Finding collaborators does not always come with the intent of gathering data for publication, but it's also important for us to understand if any change is required in the current prototype. We always want to make sure that we don't interfere with clinical workflow, and we guarantee the safety, of course, of operators and patients. Regulatory is always working with us on almost daily basis in order to assess the safety and the risks of our products. And whenever we have something that is final, we work with them in order to finalize core algorithms and workflow, and then derive claims that have to be submitted to obtain FDA approval. Marketing and sales team, along with manufacturing, customer support, and experience, are at the end of this process, but do represent actually the strongest connection that we have with our customers in order to ensure that we have competitive advantage and we're delivering what is requested by our customers. So I'd like to thank you, and I'm happy to take further questions.